Good.
One, hey everyone, I'm Brian Boyler. I'm the publisher of the Off Message newsletter, and I'm delighted to be joined this morning. Well, I guess it's morning my time, by Andrew Weissman, whose own Substack is called Behind the Headlines. Andrew was a federal prosecutor for many years. He was one of the lead prosecutors on Robert Mueller's team investigating the first Trump campaign and Russian interference in the 2016 election, which is a role that earned him a spot on the second Trump administration's blacklist for mean lawyers. We were discussing. I thought he might be off the list, but apparently he's still on it. But we're here today because he's written an important book called Liar's Kingdom. I recommend it. It's about how to deter and defeat election lies using the law. But it's a breezy read for non-lawyers. I've already borrowed heavily from it in an article I wrote last week called Disqualify Spencer Pratt, which we'll get to in a bit. Beyond the specific topic matter, I like the book for other reasons. One is that it's very handy, right? Like what I try to do here is sort of take an inventory of things that I know from years of reporting, which is about Congress and procedure and elections, and look for tools that can help create obstacles to anti-democratic forces. I often think of that scene from the movie Apollo 13 where the crew's going to suffocate and they need to filter the carbon dioxide and have like a hose and a sock and some duct tape. And Andrew's book is kind of like that. Like, how do we assemble a protective mechanism from the tools we have on hand? But it stems from and practice and the study of law. And then the other reason is that it packages discrete and actionable remedies for reform democracy once this administration has passed, this is an exceptionally broad category, obviously, because so much will need to be rebuilt and it will need to be rebuilt more robustly than it existed before. And so I see the book as a kind of model for other experts with different bureaucratic and technical knowledge. Like there should be a book like this for protecting public health from various cranks, or for protecting the treasury from looting, either for private profit or for impoundments or for whatever else. And that way, if there's an opportunity to rebuild in 2.5 years, the people in charge will be able to move quickly. So that's my review of the book. As Trump might say, I give it my complete and total endorsement. And so, Andrew, if you wouldn't mind just fleshing out the idea a bit more than I just did, like talk a little bit about how specifically you propose deterring and defeating election lies. And then let's talk about how you go about implementing it and what pitfalls we ought to be looking out for, and sort of stress test the idea.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. Thank you for all those comments. I really appreciate the fact that you said that this is something that non-lawyers can read. And that is thanks to a fantastic editor at Little Brown. People who are listening may know the whole backstory that Little Brown really stepped into the breach when my prior publisher got scared off by one of the Trump executive orders and was like, we're too scared essentially to touch this. And so Little Brown stepped in, and thank God they did, because I had such a great working relationship with an editor to make this something that everyone can read. Anyway, to get to your question, I do this podcast with Mary McCord where every week we cover sort of the latest legal news that we think is most salient, obviously, since the Trump 2.0 administration. It's, this is drinking from a fire hose. But like this week, I was struck by the number of stories that we covered. And the podcast, by the way, is called Main Justice. Where it's just all about lies. Here's just one quick example. The Department of Energy, the head of the Department of Energy had said, no, we've been canceling grants, but it has nothing to do about where the companies are located and whether the grants are in blue states or red states. And the head of it's like, no, that's outrageous. We would never do that. Well, one of the stories that happened this week was that the Trump administration lawyers conceded, oh yeah, no, that is why we did it. And $81 million of grants, this is just one tranche, were reinstated by the judge when the government's own lawyers had to concede that, yes, they were actually targeting these companies because they worked in blue states, which is just unreal. Even if you leave the legality part aside, just like who thinks that way? Um, but also to the point that it meant that the person who said no way, no how is this, we never would decide it this way. Well, wasn't true. And so um, I was very struck by the fact that we have this deluge of political lies by candidates, by people in office. Obviously, this is not the first administration to have political lies, although I do think we have it on an extraordinary basis for a whole variety of reasons that I talk about in the book and give examples of. Um, so I look overseas to see what other countries have done and what are possible models, ones that I think might work, things that I think might not work, compared to our laws. And I'd say that the two kind of potential remedies fall into two buckets. One remedy is a law that says it's a crime to lie. So just here's a quick example. It is a crime to lie to Congress. It is not a crime for Congress to lie to us. That can be changed. To be clear, that can be changed at the federal level. And also, probably more realistically in this moment, it can be changed at the state level. I was heartened to see that Gavin Newsom, and I won't say that this was cause and effect because of my book, but I think it was just last week said he signed into law a bill that if you lie in an effort to undermine the ballot voting process, he has made that a crime. And so there are ways at the state level and the federal level to criminalize um, intentionally false factual statements. Again, not opinions, not I'm pro abortion, I'm against abortion, I'm for immigration, I'm against immigration. All of those are opinions, and you might have various views, but that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about false factual representations that are intentionally false, not just wrong. And the government would have to show that. That's one bucket. The second bucket is a disqualification, and admittedly, this is easier at the state level than at the federal level because of existing case law. But an example of that from overseas is England and Brazil. Let me just tell you about England because a lot of people think, oh, well, it's England. You know, that so much of our legal system comes from that English heritage. They have a law that if a candidate for office intentionally lies about their political opponent, they cannot win. They cannot hold that office. The last time that was applied, the person who was found to have intentionally lied won that election, and the court said, you cannot sit because you have so disrupted what it means to have a free and fair election, and you're not allowed to intentionally lie. And just to be clear, after due process, and the person gets to be heard and say why they didn't, what they said was either true, or if it was wrong, why it wasn't intentionally wrong. So those are the two models that I talk about, and really stress the anomaly that while we criminalize and civilly regulate all sorts of intentionally false factual speech, we do not do it with respect to politicians. And while there are definitely upsides and downsides to my proposal, I'm enough of a lawyer to, engage in that kind of thinking about, it was true when you're in government. You think about what is the proposal, what are the things that what are the downsides, what are the upsides, and how, if there are downsides, how do you mitigate it? And is there a way to mitigate it sufficiently that the upsides are worth it? That this is one where we really stand out among sort of so-called Western democracies as a country that is not taking action to deal with a problem that I think is going to be with us, certainly in my lifetime, if we don't do something.
So I don't think I'm spoiling too much to say that you look abroad for how they handled this in countries where they had successfully addressed it, and then you kind of run it through the filter of our constitutional system to come up with ideas that you think could pass sort of constitutional muster. So
Yep.
I kind of want to just stipulate for the purposes of our conversation that you're right about that we could create at the state level or at the federal level new law or series of laws that deter election lies, just as you described. And so I want to just like kind of imagine the world under the Weissman Acts, or
Yep.
whatever you would want to call them.
Yep.
And so
I think
the
so.
first question,
One of the things I call it is sort of like a Truth in Elections Act,
yeah,
and just think of it as if anyone here has a prescription for a medication, it's like or watches TV and sees advertisements. It's truth in advertising. This is like you can't put anything you want on your pill bottle. You can't have a commercial which says anything it wants. There's all sorts of regulations. So this is a truth in election advertising.
right. The book has all kinds of excellent analogies to, we talk about free speech all the time as if there's literally nothing you could say that you could get in trouble for here, but that's clearly not true. And you run through it
Right.
in the advertising context, in the fraud context, in the obstruction context. Um, but so if we have these truth in advertising laws, we have the ability to disqualify people who
Right.
have lied about the outcomes of elections or the way elections work, right? So I guess the first question I have for you is about whether a law or set of laws like this can be written in a way that ensures against weaponization against bad faith actors. So here's a hypothetical.
Yep.
So we've made it a disqualifying offense to lie about an election, but we haven't yet fixed some of the other election fairness issues that we have in this country. So we still have gerrymandered maps, we still have
Totally.
voter suppression, and by a Democrat loses a close election, and in losing, they say, maybe in figurative terms more than literal ones, Republicans stole this from me. If they hadn't rigged the system, I would have won this election. Like most Democrats don't talk quite like that, but they do have real grievances along these lines that are not lies, right? Stacey Abrams was, I think, rightfully aggrieved about the election she ran, where she had sort of one arm tied behind her back because of the laws on the books in Georgia. And yet, those kinds of complaints, they do cast a cloud of legitimacy around election results. So would candidates like that be subject to disqualification in your schema?
Well, so this issue comes up all the time in the criminal law when you have a charge of somebody making a false statement. It's very, very factually dependent on what exactly did the person say and then what was their intent. So if somebody, let's just take somebody like Stacey Abrams says, this election was essentially stolen from me because of the various ways in which there was voter suppression. And that bucket obviously could include a whole variety of things. Um, and if she were able to say, well, I was talking about the gerrymandering, I was talking about steps that you have for voter qualification that helps suppress the black vote. I was talking about ads that undermine the willingness of certain people to vote. There's a whole panoply of things that could be defended easily as both being accurate and certainly not intentionally false. Even if you could prove any part of that was false, you would then have to show it was intentionally false. But if somebody says, there was fraud in the 2020 election and I won, because there's no way that Joe Biden got that many votes. And dead people, were voting in Detroit, and more people voted in Philadelphia than there are registered voters, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You would have to show in that situation, if you were the government, that that those statements were false and that they were intentionally so. And usually the battle is more about, is it intentional or not? And this is something that Jack Smith, if we'd ever had a trial, was going to need to show that it was intentionally false when he was making these statements. And, he has described both in various interviews and in his report why and how he was going to be able to prove that, including people on the inside talking to him and telling him and giving him data and things he said, both even before the election, that he was going to say that there was fraud in the election, et cetera. All sorts of ways that you go about proving intentionality. And so I find I'm going to turn it back to, I find the harder issue, and I do address this, this sort of, there is no new check that doesn't have the possibility of weaponization. And somebody who, um, in fact, just wants to disqualify their opponent raising this claim. And there's no question that this weapon, if it's deemed or this tool will be weaponized in the way that we have seen the Justice Department currently completely
Yeah.
weaponized, by uh, in my view, by Pam Bondi and Todd Blanche and by Donald Trump, and Kash Patel while we're at it, and in a whole variety of ways. And so the question is, are there enough checks and balances? And I think there are a variety of answers to that. But let me just give one um, potential answer, which is a concrete data point. I'm from New York. New York, as many people know, I like to say that I'm an inveterate New Yorker. And I think I've told this anecdote before, which is I lived in Washington for 10 years and I kept on telling people I'm an inveterate New Yorker. And one of my old New Yorker friends said, "You really can't say that anymore," which is like if you're from New York, that's like a dagger to the heart, because you think of yourself as, a New Yorker for life. I
I've
assume you
I've
do.
I've noticed. I've
Yeah.
noticed this about New Yorkers.
Exactly. And so New York has a statute that says that if you are a public official, elected or not, just a public official, if you are convicted of a criminal offense, um, obviously you get due process, you get to defend yourself. If you're convicted of a criminal offense, you are automatically removed from office. Period. The end. Out. It is considered so antithetical to what it means to take an oath of office and who you should be. Um, and we do not have the problem in New York of seeing that of sort of political prosecutions over and over at the state level where one side wins and the other side immediately is like, oh, I'm gonna see if we can cook up some crime. So one, we don't see that, and two, there is the criminal justice system as a bulwark, which is that you can't just say, "Oh, you committed a crime," and so happens. Even this is something that Donald Trump and Pam Bondi and Todd Blanche are realizing, because you know what, you want to indict 6 members of Congress for putting out a video that is consistent with the First Amendment and is factually accurate. Well, not only in that situation, not only can you not prove the case, you couldn't even get a grand jury to agree that there's probable cause, just a very, very low standard for bringing an indictment. So there are checks in the system for that kind of abuse, and you can rely on those kinds of checks if what I am proposing were to become law. And there's data, not just in foreign countries, but in this country that can be used to sort of encourage people to see why that abuse won't happen, or it's not a sufficient issue, especially if you think this is a real problem. I mean, I think the
Yeah.
more you see this as a huge problem, the more you're sort of saying, well, yes, it's nothing's risk free, and the problem here is so great that it outweighs whatever I see those risks being.
Right, because I guess the concern is twofold. One is you don't want to disqualify people with good faith grievances
Of
about why their
course,
election ended, right?
of
But
course,
then the second one is that if you have this tool available, we live in a world where the two parties don't operate an equal measure of good faith, and that if you enact this law to deter the kind of corrosive lies that we've been living with, then the people who tell the corrosive lies are going to go start trying to say, well, this and that and the other thing that the Democrats are complaining about and how we conduct ourselves. Those are casting doubt on elections, and we're going to try to disqualify all of them, and then they end up in court, like for uh,
right.
or and I guess I wonder if there's a way to tweak the proposal such that if you do this frivolously, like maybe not a disqualification penalty, but a financial penalty, anything to make it like you only use this if you're really after something real, not just to tie your opposition up in court forever.
Yeah, well, there is something right now, which is Rule 11 sanctions, where if you are bringing a case that is frivolous, that you can be sanctioned. And there are various judges now who are looking into that in connection with things that they're seeing in the Trump administration. So those kinds of tweaks are possible if you were to see that this was being abused, that people were bringing frivolous cases. You could also do something which happens in the civil law, where the pleading has to be the actual facts alleging why this is false and why it's intentionally so have to be sufficiently concrete and clear. By the way, that exists in defamation law. And it's a way of creating a bit of a threshold so that you're not sort of inundated with bogus claims. And so there are ways that the courts have dealt with similar issues, and they're really good ones to flag as to why that is. By the way, I see one of the questions that we got was just like, how is it that the president who is right now stands convicted of 34 felonies? How can he even run for president? And to be clear, what I'm saying is if this had happened and somebody was convicted of a felony and was a New York public official, they would not be able to hold office. That is a state law, and they're obviously there are 50 states. There are lots of states that can have all sorts of different rules. It's much more complicated at the federal level as to adding restrictions and also removing somebody from office because it raises some thorny constitutional issues as to whether the criteria in the Constitution are exclusive. Would it take a constitutional amendment? I'm very much trying to come up with things that do
Mhm.
not take constitutional amendments because of how hard it is. It's not that it can't happen. It's just like that is like a high hurdle.
So I guess it's like a relief to you as a New Yorker that Donald Trump cannot now become like mayor of New York City or governor of New York. He's disqualified from those offices.
I would say for many reasons. There's um, uh, there are lots of reasons aside from legality that I don't think he would. I don't think he's particularly popular in his former hometown.
Yeah, I've heard that. So I, I think that your answer to the previous question probably gets at the next one, but what about perspective lies that are meant to that are meant to subvert faith in elections, but aren't specific to a current result, right? Because Trump will say the only way I can win is by if they cheat, right? Or I'm sorry, the only way I can lose, right, is if they cheat. And when he says that, it's bullshit at least, if not a lie. But when I say that Donald Trump right now is setting things up to try to steal the midterms if he can, that's real, right? That's not a lie, but it is a warning about the risk of a stolen election. Well, I'd like for there to be a penalty for his tactic. It's hard for me to think of how you penalize his sort of perspective lying in a way that would keep it kosher for me to say that, hey, like watch Republicans, they are trying to steal the midterms.
So, that I think is going to be much more of a opinion as to what you think is going to happen.
Okay.
Anything that's in the future, um, is going to be an opinion about and a prediction of what's going to happen. Now, if you were to say they are currently doing something, then depending on what you say and how much evidence you have and whether you believe what you're saying, that is potentially actionable. And this is where, we don't, there's lots of ways in which I'm suggesting things that are new, although not totally new if you look at the globe, but
Mhm.
would be new for us here in the United States. But this is one where a lot of these are all great questions, but a lot of times I'm like, let's not reinvent the wheel. Defamation law deals exactly with what your question is, which is, could it be defamation if you're saying this is my opinion, or this is what I think is going to happen in the future, or this is what I think they're going to do in the future? Um, I'm talking about facts. Um, the election was stolen is a good example of that. Or we did not target grants and grantees based on the states they were in. That's a specific thing where you're saying this specifically happened, and the issues are, is it true or false? And then what was your intentionality? Did you just make a mistake? Or was it something that you knew you were deliberately lying about? And so, um, a good example of that is everyone who's listening has had to have heard about the whole slush fund. And the slush fund issue was, to me, was predicated on two falsehoods. One of them was that there was some real lawsuit and this was a quote unquote settlement. Well, to me, that's a lie. I think that depending on if there's a discovery, if the Florida judge orders discovery and were to look into this, and let's assume that the facts are that there was no actual adversity, that this was just Donald Trump saying, I'm going to, quote, settle my own lawsuit for close to $2 billion. And it wasn't sort of a negotiated settlement. And this wasn't like a real lawsuit. It was just a fig leaf. That could be actionable if you were to make direct false statements about, oh no, this was a real litigation and there was adversity and, I wanted a lot more and they pushed back and this operated like a normal settlement. If you could show that that was not true and people were lying about it, that could easily fall within. Those are false statements. Um, Whether the law would criminalize that, or whether you would have a law that says only lies about voting or, in some restricted way, that's a separate issue. The second type of falsehood is that the money we create the slush fund, and the money that we have is going to be used for victims. And I, the president of the United States, am going to set up this commission because I think that all of the people who were prosecuted in January 6th, I view them as victims. Now, as outrageous as that is in my view, because
Mhm.
they are convicted perpetrators, not victims, the president thinking they should be treated as victims, that's his opinion. That is not that's not a false factual statement. Like, so, and when I'm thinking about, okay, how would you apply what I'm saying to that situation? I can readily distinguish sort of sort of what I call lie one from false statements two, about whether you are going to describe people and see them as victims or not. That to me is a subjective view, in the same way that you can have subjective views about whether you think the Constitution protects a woman's right to choose or not. Like those are things that are not factually false, or whether how you interpret a particular case, or what your opinion is of a movie. And there's just lots of things. Did you like this book or not like this book, or do you like this person or not like this person? All of those are opinions. And the law with respect to defamation and false statements is very, very different when it comes to opinions than it is with respect to cold, hard facts. And what I'm talking about, by the way, is not new to me. That distinction of the law treating opinion differently than facts is one that's already embedded in the law. So nothing I'm
Mhm.
proposing is taking us down a whole new road on that. It is just saying that this should apply to politicians too.
Mhm.
Why are we exempting them from the analysis that we apply to all sorts of other people? Corporate executives, people who speak to Congress, people who are interviewed by when I was a prosecutor or an FBI agent, and you lie to them. If you apply to a bank for a loan, all of those are situations where we criminalize intentionally false factual statements.
I'm glad you do the distinction because Trump makes such a perfect test case of this because the lies he told after losing in 2020 were so cut and dry. But it makes me wonder about maybe it's like the opposite problem, which is that you can do a lot of damage to democracy and cast a lot of doubt on the integrity of elections without telling black and white lies the way Trump did, right? Like I think back, were you at the Justice Department during the U.S. Attorney scandal 20 years ago?
I was.
Under okay,
I was I was I was working for Director Mueller. I believe I think when that happened, I was his special counsel.
got it. So you weren't in main justice, right? Where I think the scandal was located, but there was my recollection of the situation. It's been a while. Is that you had this sort of messaging or propaganda infrastructure on the right, and a lot of it was situated in the Heritage Foundation. And mostly the purpose was to suggest that election fraud was rampant, and they did this in order to justify voter suppression measures. But then it turned into this kind of pressure on U.S. attorneys to bring actual cases. And so this is like misleading conduct, it's abusive conduct. But it strikes me that it can happen without anyone telling a Trump style lie that this specific election was fraudulent and the loser won and the winner lost. Um, and I'm wondering if the TIA or the Weissman Acts do anything about that kind of corrosive innuendo that isn't
Um,
really.
yeah, so I have two comments on that. One is that depending on what someone says at the time, it could um, it could catch people who are telling intentional lies, either for to perpetrate the wrong or to cover up the wrong. Because as you know, sometimes it's not what you did, it's what you did after you did the thing that you did.
Mhm.
It's the cover up that gets you, not the underlying crime. And a lot of times the cover up does have intentional lies, and so it could catch it that way. The second thing is that um, I wouldn't mind if the debate were, oh, we're now at a second level, which is, um, are they saying something that is a factual statement, not an opinion, and is it intentional? Like, in other words, all that discussion moves us into a
Mhm.
different sphere where it's like, okay, we've already accomplished some deterrent where people know, do not you can there's real cost to lying to the American public. And can I give you an example of what I think, and
Please.
this is an opinion, but I think
I'm
that
going to sue you.
I think Donald Trump is keenly aware of this distinction. And why do I say that? And I do talk about this in Liar's Kingdom. Let's go back to the first impeachment. That's the one where Donald Trump's on the phone with President Zelensky in Ukraine and has the so-called perfect call. And um, there's then an impeachment, and then there's a trial. And Donald Trump publicly is saying over and over again and loudly with his bully pulpit megaphone, which he's entitled to use, that this was the perfect call and there was no quid pro quo. And he says all of that about not just not just it's a perfect call. That's nebulous, but that there was no quid pro quo. Even though it seems, to me, it seemed plainly obvious that that's exactly what was going on, which is like if you announce that there's a fraud investigation so that I can then say Joe Biden is under an criminal investigation and vote in a foreign country, then you will get the congressionally mandated military aid, which, by the way, in retrospect, was just so critical for them to have. And Donald Trump said all of that publicly because that is not, in this country, a crime. It is not actionable. But you know where he did not say that? He did not say it to Congress. He did not. He did not testify either in the House or the Senate. He didn't even submit a statement, whether sworn or unsworn, saying, "I was on the call. This is what's going on. Here's my evidence." all of that, if he had submitted a statement, that is subject to the criminal laws. It is a crime to lie to Congress. And so he did not do that, and he just took to the airways. And I think it was Corey Lewandowski when
Yep.
someone
I was going to
said
say this.
you got caught, saying something that was not true to the public, said, "Well, that's not a crime." And so, but he admitted it when he was sort of finally being questioned in a setting where it would have been a crime to lie. Howard Lutnick could be another example of that. He is the Commerce Secretary who very famously or recently went on air and touted. I mean, I remember hearing it at the time and said that he and his wife went to the Epstein house, and we were essentially, I'm going to paraphrase, but we were so disgusted by what we saw. And there was a massage table like right out in the open, and I think it was the living room or the dining room. And we just went, blech, like we're leaving and we never want to see him again. And oh, can you imagine? And it's just awful. And I mean, he really gilded the lily. And we all know that that is, to put it bluntly, inaccurate. Like, I mean, and he had to know that wasn't true because he, in fact, had business dealings with him. And then he turned his yacht around with his family members on it to spend time on the island and also brought, I believe, his babysitter at Jeffrey Epstein's request. To the island. So none of that is consistent with we never wanted to see him again. But again, that making a false statement publicly is not actionable in the way that it was done. But that's all something that, the law is not like my father was a scientist. The law is not like science where there like there's going to be gravity. There's what is in the cell of all of us is something that's knowable and can be discovered, but there's an objective truth. Science it works that way. The law is something that we construct, and we can construct it to um, to make the world that we want to live in, and to create incentives, positive and negative, to be able to disincentivize the behavior we don't want and to incentivize the behavior we do want. And I teach to wonderful young students, and I'm always telling them that is like, think big and think about what world you want to live in, because you're in a field where that's possible. It's not
Mhm.
like science has a very different and wonderful mission, but it's not subjective in the way that law is.
I think you can see it too in the distinction between what Trump was saying after the 2020 election and what his lawyers were saying in all those lawsuits that they filed and lost. Is that if they had been basically taking dictation from Trump and then saying those things to a judge without evidence, that would be sanctionable, right? But
Absolutely. Well,
they drew a pretty firm line.
yeah, that's a great point. So one of the remarkable things in those, was it 61 cases, I believe,
Yeah.
right after the election, is, in many of those, the judge is like, well, are you claiming fraud? And the lawyers are like, no. And that's because there are consequences, because lawyers are officers of the court. And if you lie to a judge, there can not only can that be criminal, but you can have your bar license pulled, either permanently or at least temporarily, CEG Rudy Giuliani.
Yeah. Uh, would there be an ex post facto issue with people for all the lies that have been told up to this point if you were to pass the kind of laws that you're talking about, where you
On
couldn't retroactively sanction the old
um,
lies?
Yeah, with respect to criminal law, absolutely, you cannot go backwards. And I'm enough of a, people know me as mostly because of the role I had as a criminal prosecutor, but I also was a defense lawyer for 10 years. Absolutely, criminal laws cannot work retroactively.
Right.
Civil laws can, but
Okay.
criminal laws definitely should not. I mean, that is the whole idea is that you should have notice of what the law is. And so you can't just say, oh, by the way, let me just tell you what you did before. We're now making it a crime. And that would never go in this country. There are very strong rules on that on the criminal side.
but if the disqualification you have in mind is a civil penalty, um, I ask this because you have set aside, since we've dealt with the innuendo question. You have all these people. They say Joe Biden was certified the winner of the 2020 election, and they're propounding the lie without lying, right? But you still have a lot of people in the current Republican Party who are all in on the lie, the same lie that Trump tells,
Yes.
right? And I don't have a full count, but it's dozens, or maybe across the country
Right.
hundreds. Would they? You imagine like a kind of amnesty, or like a possible, like, wipe the slate clean by attesting that you no longer believe the lies you were telling from 2020 on? Or would this be like a wiped out event for Republicans who are currently serving?
Well, it let me just put it this way. I am not proposing that people have to um take like a loyalty oath,
Right.
and that it's like, oh, you have to say X or Y. I mean, for one thing, they could take the Fifth Amendment, and say I'm refusing to answer because a truthful answer would tend to incriminate me, assuming like we have this law going forward. Um, and um, so I'm trying to not sort of say, "Oh, you have to say X," um, and this is that the government is dictating what the truth is. I'm modeling this on a system where like you can have a false statement law, and then it's left to a jury and a judge to assess whether that's been
Right.
proved. But it's very different than the German model I speak about, where in Germany there is a law, it's true in other parts of Europe as well, where the state has said that it is a crime to deny that the Holocaust existed in a public setting, where it could affect people, and that has been held to be constitutional and consistent with their free speech rules because it rubs up against other constitutional provisions about the sanctity of sort of personhood and the dignity of personhood. I actually quote from that decision. I spoke to the
Mhm.
one of the judges who worked on that case. It's an incredibly moving decision and very sensitive. But I do talk about why I think that's not the appropriate model for us, where we would be saying to somebody, essentially, you have to say X. My view is you don't have to say X or Y. It's like if you choose to lie, then there can be consequences, both criminal and whether you can hold office. But you can still say those things. We're not stopping you. Like you made, let's assume we have a law that's just we have a disqualification law. It's like, fine, you can go ahead and talk about, let's just take the Holocaust denial. You want to say that till you're blue in the face in the state of New York. Let's assume they have a disqualification law. It's like, you can do that. It's just, you can't also run for office. So that would be the way I deal with that
Well,
nuanced issue.
the reason I asked about it in the context of retroactivity is that if the law were to pass as you envision it, and then you were a person who lived in Lauren Boebert's district, and you would be like, I'm challenging her as she runs for reelection. I'm also going to try to get her disqualified because from 2020 through 2028, she was propounding the same exact lies Donald Trump was propounding. And
Right.
there's a bunch of people in Republican politics who meet that
Yeah.
criteria.
So
And
here's an easy way to deal
would they
with
all
it.
be
This
strike
is what
them?
I would say. This is what I would say is the easiest way to deal with that is, I mean, so that you don't have to deal with the retroactivity issue. Let's assume that we now have a law that either criminalizes and or disqualifies, and there's a new election in 5 years, and you are running against me, and you say to me as part of the election, well, was there fraud in the election or not? Right? And if I say, "Yes, there was fraud in the election," like, you've got a new statement. Or I say, "I'm refusing to answer that." I mean, okay, like, you kinda win the debate then at that point, right? It's like you're s
Sure.
or, so that I just feel like that there's a way, because we're dealing with this salient fact, you can just re-up it and say, "Well, what's your position?" and see what people say. And if they end up having to be mealy mouthed about it, we've at least moved the debate because they're not willing to just go flat out with what I'll call the Trumpian. There was fraud in the election, and this is what the Dominion voting systems did, and this is what the two Georgia election workers did. All sort of very specific things that can be proved to be false.
Point well taken. So your book is proposes specific federal reforms, and because of that, it
And
looks
state, and
mostly
state.
and it. Well, yeah, you're beating me to the point.
Okay,
So,
sorry.
but the laws that you're talking about are federal, so they would have to wait until 2029 or beyond. You note that there
Totally.
could be analogous laws governing state elections, and as it happens, I was reading your book just as Republicans started applying the 2020 playbook to the Los Angeles mayor's race, and
Yeah.
I run a bit hot. So I was like, aha, like Andrew's put this idea out here. They're basically running a test of it. Let's have it out, right? Like we can kill two birds with one stone. Like California can fix the problems. It's like logistical difficulties counting ballots without doing it under the shadow of election lies, because they could simultaneously say, you're lying about elections. We're going to pass a law that says you can't run for office on the basis of these lies. Um, and I guess I'm wondering if you think I popped off a bit, if you see a problem with that idea, either on the law or on the strategic sequencing of it, because I mean, you couldn't have predicted that they were going to re-up 2020 style lines just as your book was hitting the bestseller list. But that's what happened.
Yeah, I mean, um, I I assume that the lie about the 2020 election is one that we are going to be living with for a long time. So I there's a lot where I didn't imagine it was going to happen exactly at the time, but like, when Donald Trump started railing about the Brazilian judicial system,
Mhm.
it was as I'm writing my chapter about Brazil, which, I was like, okay, this is very timely. Um, and so um, this is one where, you can see Gavin Newsom, I think he must have been reading about it and thinking about it. I mean, because he tweeted on, I believe it was X, because somebody sent it to me. I'm not on X. You can make your own decisions about whether you want to be on X or not. But so I think that it is certainly a strategy. I'm not in the sort of political, and, I'm not a political analyst, so I'm gonna leave to you sort of like the wisdom of it and the
Mhm.
timing and the strategy calls, 'cause, that's not my forte, and as I keep on telling Nicole Wallace, like, I really try and stay in my lane because otherwise you're hearing from me in something that I don't really have anything particularly unique or an expertise to offer, as opposed to sort of the law world, where at least hopefully I have some knowledge on that's different that I can apply to a situation.
Yeah, I wrote it, and then I started thinking, if Newsom were to sign a TIA style law now in a manner designed to tell people like Spencer Pratt, what you're doing is disqualifying yourself from future elections,
Yeah,
that Republicans in Alabama might be like, oh, well, if anyone says that Joe Biden won the 2020 election, then they can't run in Alabama. And then you have this kind of arms race about truth and falsity. And who adjudicates that? The Supreme Court? Are they going to have to say these laws are based on truth and these laws are based on lies? Like how?
so this is where I will say, the last couple episodes of Main Justice, we deal with this. This is what courts do all the time. Courts deal with facts and law. And so that when you are saying something that is factually false, so when we did, one of the other issues we dealt with this week was the president issued an executive order saying that we need to have truth in terms of our history be done by our national parks. And truth in our history, he claimed, was eradicating any mention of slavery, women's suffrage, what we did to indigenous people. And the court dealt with that and said, that's not truth. That's essentially, this is me paraphrasing, that's not truth. That's a lie. And this is one where there's nothing like having a judge turn to you and say, "Okay, Brian, what what's your evidence? Like, what do you got?" So it's the difference between being able to spout off and say so and so won and being in a court of law. And as I said, I think that's the reason that you saw and you still see people perfectly willing to say things in the public sphere that they're unwilling to say in a circumstance where they actually can be held to account if they lie, and they have to come up with the evidence. And to your point, in the 60 or so cases, the lawyers didn't actually say there's fraud in a whole series of them because the judge is like, "What's your evidence?" And they're like, "No, no, no, no. We're arguing about some smaller things about access or like the counting of certain ballots, but we're not saying there was all this fraud." Because in courts, that's sort of like that subjective. Oh, who's going to decide? The courts are the system that we have created for adjudicating what do we do when there is someone saying X and someone saying Y when it's something factual. And so we have a system that's already been created that we can take advantage of. And I would say right now, at least at the district court levels on the federal side, we are seeing judges of all political persuasions standing up for truth and law.
I uh I see a question here. It says, "Is Brian at the doctor?" Because behind me is this anatomy. I am I am in. I normally work in a little home office, but my internet is not traveling up there, so I had to scramble to move to this little nook in my kitchen where we, for whatever reason, have hung this thing up. My health is fine. Thank you for your concern. Um, I appreciate that because I want to believe that this problem is addressable without it just spiraling into a new he said, she said kind of thing where
Yes.
they attack a good faith effort with a bad faith effort. And I think like a huge part of why your book appealed to me is because at the broadest level, I think that's what it's about, right? It's about how democracy depends on good faith. And the problem with bad faith in right wing politics is something I've been writing about for many years, like going back to even before Trump ran his first campaign. Because just in covering legislation and elections, it became clear that if one party is embracing bad faith dealing and manipulation and trafficking and lies about how the economy works and this and that as a means of building and hoarding power, the system's just eventually going to crack. You
Yeah.
can't have it be the case that Democrats appropriate funds for everyone or respond to disasters in every state while Republicans deprive blue states of their share, right? That doesn't work.
Absolutely.
That ends in national divorce or a war or whatever. And you can't have the law apply equally across partisan lines under Democrats, and then have Republicans pardon insurrectionists while charging peaceful protesters because they're
Right.
supposedly members of Antifa. Like that doesn't work either. And so in 2020, before the election, so this was before Stop the Steal got underway, I wrote a piece about how Democrats should seek to govern because Biden was ahead. It seemed like he was going to win. They should seek to govern in a way that deters bad faith using politics, right? And I wanted them to be experimenting with legislation, make it remove the president's discretion to withhold disaster relief from blue states, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so that Republicans would have to compete on the merits, right? Like they would have to politic on the basis of honest, spun, but ultimately honest appeals. It hadn't occurred to me way back then that one could use like the actual justice system toward the same end. And I'm wondering if you have any closing thoughts on the interplay between the political side of things and the legal side of things, by which I mean like courtrooms, not like
Yeah.
legislation about disaster relief. Because on the one hand, it's hard for me to imagine us evolving toward more enlightened politics on the basis of laws and punishments alone. On the other hand, it's also hard for me to imagine politics and shame and rhetoric and these other kinds of intangible things getting us there without a kind of
Yeah.
you need a carrot and a stick, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just as a sort of concluding piece, I mean, I'm a lawyer and I'm at heart very much an institutionalist. And so I do think about how do we make our systems better? How do we make our systems harden the target and make it harder to infiltrate democratic institutions? And it's not a failsafe, and certainly my book is not in by far the only thing that is needed. And there are lots of of important reforms that I think we're going to have to undertake. But systems should be working for us. At the end of the day, we're all humans. That humans can figure out ways to get around institutions and to undermine them, but we certainly don't have to make it easier for them to do that. And that if I had one message to people, even if you thought, okay, well, Andrew's idea is interesting, but I'm not sure I'm convinced, is that that's of course totally fine. But I think that we're going to be living with the problem of sort of political lies and sort of Trumpism for a long time because people are going to emulate what he has done. It's been successful and people are going to try and do it. And so we cannot, if we get out of this in the next 2 years, we cannot just be thinking, okay, we're done. Let's pretend that this never happened. I think that is a fool's errand. And this is the 250th anniversary of our country. And it's incumbent on us to figure out what have the framers done that is really invaluable and worth keeping and what is not working. And there's no reason our generation can't be part of the solution trying to fix it. And it is living in denial is not going to be the answer if we get out of this and pretending that it never happened. And so whether you think this is among the package of what's needed or something else, it's great for people to be thinking about it and also staying engaged. There's no more important time to be doing that.
Amen. Well, the book is called Liar's Kingdom. Do you happen to have a copy on hand that you could hold up?
I
I left mine
do.
upstairs with all the technical gremlins chasing me out of my office.
I do.
There it is. Congratulations! It's number one bestseller. So,
It
I said
is.
to you when
It's
I asked you to
number.
do this,
Yeah.
you don't need me to help you sell copies, but I want to because I think it's
Thank you.
important.
No, thank you.
And I also want whichever your publisher, your first publisher was who got the willies and dropped you. I hope that they noticed that they missed out on a bestseller because maybe that
I'm
would make
sure
them.
they did.
We can't disqualify them from publishing, but maybe they can learn the normal incentive way that when a good idea comes before them, they shouldn't avoid it just because it might piss off Donald Trump.
Right. Totally great. Well,
Well,
thank you so much. And thanks to everybody
thank
for
you.
joining in.
All right. Bye bye.